quilting. Before we pull out the sewing machine, we need to apply the backing fabric to our quilt. For my quilt, I'm using black cotton fabric cut to approximately the same size as my batting. You can cut it slightly larger if you'd like. I find the easiest way to apply backing fabric is to iron it to the back side of my background. This allows me to ensure that there are no wrinkles and to have basically a smooth surface with which to begin quilting. Once I've ironed it in place, I flip it over and add a few pins to each corner. Be sure to pin on the front of the quilt so it'll be easier to remove them during the quilting process. If you've never tried free motion quilting before, I recommend creating a few practice quilt sandwiches. Place batting between two pieces of muslin or other scrap fabric and try creating some of these designs. The first one uses both horizontal and vertical lines to create a pattern. Another motif to try is a grid in which you use horizontal and vertical lines crisscrossing. And then on top of that, you could try adding some circles in a different color. Another fun design, once you've tried circles, is spirals. You spiral into the shape and then back out and then off to a new location to make a new spiral. This technique is what I call square and square or rectangle and rectangle. I start in one corner and continue to make squares and rectangles until the entire quilt is covered with stitching. This next design is the loopy lines. I basically make slightly curved lines and then occasionally add a little loop. This one is fairly densely quilted. This last one is what I call a giant dahlia. I start with a circle or a spiral in the middle and then make a round of scallops. I continue to make scallops all the way around the design, creating more and more petals as I go further from the center. To set up your machine for free motion stitching, lower the feed dogs. Your hands will be doing the feeding of the fabric, not the machine. Attach a darning foot or free motion foot. You don't need to change the stitch length in any way because the speed at which you move your hands and your feet will determine the stitch length. Load the appropriate thread in place and you're ready to begin stitching. I'm going to demonstrate free motion stitching, specifically the grid quilting pattern in which we stitch horizontal lines across the quilt and then vertical lines down the quilt. What I like about using lines as a beginning method of starting free motion quilting is that lines really let you try out both the speed at which you move your foot and the speed at which you move your hands. And the interaction of how fast the machine is going and how fast you move your hands determines the stitch length. So I usually start in the middle of the quilt, work my way to one side, and then back down the other, but you could just start at one end and work your way all the way across. And begin pushing the fabric through the machine. I pause after stitching a couple inches and move the tail end of the thread out of the way. I continue pushing the fabric through the machine. What I like about quilting straight lines, or straight-ish lines, is that you can tell very easily how the speed of your hands versus the speed of your foot change the stitch length. You can also, if you have a machine that has an adjustable speed control, you can adjust the speed control to see how it will affect your stitches. Generally speaking, when free motion quilting, you want fast feet and slow hands. That gives you a fairly consistent small stitch. However, the faster your hands go, the larger the stitch, and the more consistent you are with the speed of your hands and the speed at which you're pressing the pedal, the more consistent your stitch length will be. What I really enjoy about free motion quilting is that you don't necessarily have to push the fabric through and rotate the quilt around at each line. You can both push and pull the fabric as I'm demonstrating here. So I've reached a point where some of the fabric was overlapping another piece of fabric and I hadn't glued it down with fusible webbing. So I paused and went slow over that part, making sure to pull the fabric tight so as not to cause a pucker or a wrinkle. I finished stitching and you can see that I've made the horizontal lines all the way across the quilt. I'm going to rotate the quilt 90 degrees and begin to stitch the vertical lines to create the grid. Same way as doing the horizontal lines, just push the fabric through, at a consistent speed to make a consistent stitch length. And there we have it. I've completed the grid quilting on this quilt. Sometimes there'll be a small mess up and I somehow pucker the fabric a little bit as I'm sewing over it. And I can either embrace that mistake, which is what I usually do, or if I'm really wanting to have a specific look, you can start to fray the edges of the fabric to try to make it lay flat and cover the batting. But I strongly encourage you to embrace the imperfection. Usually those little imperfections become my favorite spots on the quilt. So there's the grid pattern. The spacing between the lines is not consistent. The lines of quilting aren't completely straight, but do keep in mind I've been quilting for over 15 years, so I've had a lot of practice. And free motion stitching, the more you practice, the better you'll get. So I've changed the thread in my machine to be a slightly different color of red, and I'm going to quilt some circles, mimicking the circle pattern in some of the fabrics that I have on my background. If you're nervous about quilting circles, you can draw them with a fabric pencil by tracing a round shape, but I usually just like to go with it. So I put my needle down, stitch in place a few times to basically tie a little knot, start around the circle, pause and trim my threads a little bit, and then I move my hands in a circular motion, bringing the quilt with me. I go around 3 or 4 times to create the circle. And there's our first circle. I'm going to continue doing this, and since this thread is attached to the other circle, I won't pause and stitch it off. I'm just going to keep sewing, and I'll trim off all the threads at the end. So I stitch in place and then begin to move in the circular pattern. And generally speaking, when making circles or spirals, fast feet and fast hands make the smoothest circles. And I look at the quilt and try to determine where I'd like to basically embellish my background with extra stitching. So in this case, my embellishment is round circles. These are currently stitched with a bright red thread, and I'm going to stitch sets of 3 across the quilt a few times. And then I'm going to change my thread color. There's a lot of purple and blue in some of the background fabrics, so I want to add in a different color. Now you could randomly place the circles anywhere on the quilt. Don't necessarily have to do them in sets of 3. It's just the pattern I wanted to use because of the fabrics I had placed in my quilt. 2 sets of blue circles there, and I decided that I want 1 more blue circle in the opposite corner of the quilt to sort of balance out where the blue is in the quilt. And instead of doing a full set of 3, I'm going to sew just 1 very large blue circle in the bottom. And so this quilt top is now complete. So there are the grid pattern that we've quilted and the circles. And on the back, you can more clearly see the grid line in red and the red circles on top of it. Now we're going to look at spiral quilting. And when I do an all-over spiral, I usually start in the middle. You could start at one edge. Generally what I do is I spiral in toward the center of the spiral, and then I rotate in the opposite direction and spiral out again, and then move to a new location. So spiral in one direction, spiral out, back out, following the same lines, and then off to a new location. Spiral in, spiral out. And spiral and circles quilting is a great time to try out quilting gloves. They allow you to grip the fabric more easily and control it while you're doing free motion stitching. Once your background is quilted, trim and square up your quilt. If you started with a piece of batting that was approximately 18 by 24 inches, you can trim your quilt to be about 16 by 20 inches. After trimming your quilt, It's time to add the girl.